Residential schools continued. Part B reading. Part 1. Indian residential schools were a part of Canadian history for over 150 years, from the mid-19th century to the late 20th century. Over 150,000 Aboriginal children were removed from their homes and sent to boarding schools. The objective of the residential schools system was to assimilate Aboriginal children, or First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, into European Canadian mainstream society. Reading part 2. Christian churches of many denominations had been running day schools for Aboriginals in Canada since the 17th century. In the 1840s, the government began funding boarding schools for assimilation purposes. This practice became commonplace by 1884. An amendment to the Indian Act in 1920 made residential schooling compulsory for First Nations children. Aboriginal children aged 4 to 16 were torn from their families and sent to boarding schools across the country. The children were taught English, French, and Christianity, and were punished for using their own language or practicing their own customs. Part 3. Residential schools had a high mortality rate. In addition to at least 3,000 recorded deaths, many attendees went missing. They died from tuberculosis, school fires, and labor-related accidents, or they froze to death after running away from abuse. Many were buried in unmarked graves and are still not accounted for. Tens of thousands of other Aboriginal children suffered physical, sexual, or emotional abuse in the program. Survivors described childhoods filled with anxiety, hunger, and loneliness. Part 4. The Canadian government began to close residential schools in the 1970s, though the last school remained open until 1996. Survivors of the program say they will never get their heritage back. They can't speak their native language and have no spiritual faith or connection to elders. Some call this period in Canadian history a cultural genocide. Aboriginals who grew up in an institution also have limited parenting skills, and many have passed on the abuse and neglect they experienced.